People call us adrenaline junkies. They think we jump out of perfectly good airplanes into forest fires because we have a death wish or because we're trying to prove something to a world that stopped watching. But that's not it. We do it because fire is simple. It's physics. It eats fuel, it breathes oxygen, and it moves with the wind. If you understand the math, you can kill the beast. I spent 20 years as a smoke jumper in the northern Rockies. I've fought thousand-acre blazes that turned the sky black at noon. I thought I had seen every trick nature could pull. But I was wrong. It was August 14th, the height of the burn season. We were cruising at 3,000 feet inside a rattling Twin Otter aircraft, the turboprop screaming against the thin mountain air. The cabin smelled like aviation fuel, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of nervous energy. The floorboards vibrated violently under my boots, a sensation that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. My name is Garrick. I was the crew boss for a six-man detail out of Missoula. My job was simple: get them on the ground, get the fire line dug, and get them home. Our target was a dry lightning strike deep in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. For those who don't know, the Bob is 1,000,000 acres of nothing. No roads, no cell towers, no help. It is one of the last truly wild places in the lower 48. If you get in trouble out there, you're on your own until the helicopters can fly. And in this smoke, nobody was flying but us. 2 minutes to drop. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset, barely audible over the drone of the engines. I looked down the line at my guys. To my left was Vogel, my second in command. He was a stone-cold veteran who had been jumping since the 90s. He sat with his arms crossed, eyes closed, chewing gum with the rhythmic precision of a machine. He was checking his static line mentally, over and over again. Next to him was Tully. It was the kid's first season. He looked pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the webbing of his reserve chute. He was vibrating with adrenaline, his eyes darting around the fuselage like a trapped bird. "Breathe, Tully," I shouted over the engine roar. "It's just a spot fire. We cut a line, save the station, and we'll be drinking beers by sunset." I believed it too. At least I wanted to. I stood up and walked to the open door, grabbing the frame to steady myself against the turbulence. The wind hit me like a physical punch, freezing cold despite the summer heat rising from the valley floor below. I leaned out into the slipstream to spot the drop zone. The world below was a carpet of dark green pine broken by the jagged gray spine of the Chinese wall. But directly beneath us, the world was burning. From the air it looked small, maybe 5 acres of active crown fire. But as I stared at it, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The math was wrong. The winds aloft were pushing hard out of the west, 30 knots at least. Usually a fire creates a smoke column that drifts downwind, flagging out like a banner. But this smoke, it wasn't drifting, it was swirling. The column was rising straight up, defying the wind shear, rotating in a slow, heavy counterclockwise motion. It looked like a drain. It looked like a tightening noose. The fire wasn't spreading outward in a V-shape. It was burning in a near-perfect circle, collapsing inward toward the historic ranger station at the center. "Wind check is weird, boss," Vogel shouted, stepping up beside me, his gum-chewing stopping for the first time. "Smoke is acting heavy. It's not flagging." "I see it," I yelled back, squinting against the grit stinging my eyes. "It's creating its own weather. We drop fast. Hit the meadow, cut the west flank, anchor it to the river." I didn't know then that the smoke wasn't acting heavy because of thermals. I didn't know that the fire was being manipulated. I just knew that the gut feeling I'd relied on for 2 decades was screaming at me to close the door and turn the plane around. But we had a job to do. "Hook up," I roared, signaling the line. The crew stood up, the metallic click-clack of carabiners snapping onto the static line filling the cabin. Tully took a deep breath, his eyes wide, looking at me for reassurance. I gave him a curt nod. "Get 'em out the door." One by one, my team stepped into the void. Their static lines went taut, pulling their chutes as they vanished into the wash. Bright orange canopies blossomed below, tiny flowers against the dark, bruised purple of the smoke column. I was the last one. I stood in the doorframe, looking down at the orange glow of the burning timber one last time. The heat radiating up from the ground was palpable, even at this altitude. It felt like an open oven door. I took a breath of the thin, cold air, stepped off the ledge and fell into the haze. The silence of the canopy ride was short-lived. The ground rushed up to meet me, a blur of scrub brush and rocky soil. I flared the toggles at the last second, swinging my legs forward for the PLF. My boots hit the dirt, knees bent, rolling through the impact to dissipate the energy. I came up in a crouch, instantly fighting the nylon shroud as the wind tried to drag me across the meadow. I punched the quick-release buckles, shedding the harness, and stood up. The heat hit me instantly. It wasn't the dry, crisp heat of a typical Montana summer. This was heavy, suffocating, and wet. It felt like stepping into a sauna where someone had burned a tire. The air tasted of pine resin and ash, a grit that coated my tongue before I'd even taken my second breath. "Sound off," I yelled, keying my radio, though I could see most of the crew landing in the high alpine meadow around me. "Vogel clear," the radio crackled. "Tully clear," the rookie's voice squeaked, a little too high-pitched. "Noah clear." "O'Neill clear." "Diaz clear." I scanned the horizon. We were in a bowl, surrounded by jagged peaks, but the sky above us was wrong. The smoke filtered the sunlight into a sickly, bruised purple and orange, casting long, unnatural shadows across the grass. It felt less like afternoon and more like twilight on a different planet. "Gear up," I ordered, grabbing my pack. "We anchor on the creek bed to the west. Let's cut this flank before it wakes up." We fell into the rhythm of the work. It's a brutal, physical cadence that every smoke jumper knows by heart. The thud crunch of Pulaskis biting into the earth, the whine of the chainsaws limbing up the lower branches, the heavy breathing of men and women pushing their bodies to the limit. We were stripping the fuel away, scraping down to the mineral soil to starve the fire. I was working the line near Tully, keeping an eye on the kid when I saw Vogel stop. Vogel was about 50 yards up the slope, near a thicket of lodgepole pine that bordered the suspected ignition point. He wasn't taking a water break. He was standing perfectly still, his chainsaw idling at his side, staring at something in the tall grass. He didn't wave frantically. He didn't shout. He just raised a gloved hand and gave me a sharp, flat motion. "Come here." I wiped the sweat from my eyes and jogged up the incline, the heat radiating off the ground in shimmering waves. "What is it?" I asked, coming up beside him. "Did the fire spot over?" Vogel didn't answer. He just pointed with the bar of his saw. At first, my brain couldn't process the geometry of what I was seeing. It looked like a pile of wet, red debris dumped in the middle of the pristine grass. I took a step closer, the metallic smell of copper suddenly overpowering the scent of the smoke. It was a bull elk, a massive one, probably 700 pounds on the hoof, but it was unrecognizable. The animal hadn't been burned. The hide was slick with blood, not soot. It had been ripped in half. I don't mean it had been scavenged. I mean it had been physically torn asunder. The rear quarters were twisted and thrown 5 feet away from the torso. The rib cage wasn't crushed inward, as you'd expect from a fall or a vehicle impact. It was shattered outward, the white bone jutting out like the tines of a broken fork, as if something had reached inside the chest cavity and pulled it open. Entrails were spooled out across the wildflowers like wet rope. The head was twisted at an impossible angle, the tongue lolling out in the dust. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I'd seen animals caught in fires before. They panic, they run, they burn. Sometimes you find them curled up, suffocated by the smoke. This was violence, pure kinetic violence. "Lightning strike," I muttered, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the tree exploded and the shrapnel hit it. Vogel shook his head slowly. He crouched down, careful not to touch the gore. Lightning burns, Garrick. There isn't a singe mark on this fur. He pointed a gloved finger at the ground around the carcass. And look at the blood spray. It's directional. Something hit this thing while it was running full tilt and stopped it dead. He looked up at me, his eyes hard and unblinking beneath the brim of his helmet. Fire didn't do this, Vogel said, his voice low. And a bear eats. A cougar caches the kill. He gestured to the pristine, untouched meat of the haunches. Whatever did this didn't do it for food. It did it because it could. I looked away from the elk, scanning the tree line. The smoke swirled through the pines, gray ghosts dancing in the heat. For the first time in 20 years, the crackle of the approaching fire didn't sound like the enemy. It sounded like the only thing keeping something else at bay. "Back to the line," I said, my voice tight. "Eyes up, keep your heads on a swivel." Vogel nodded, standing up slowly. But neither of us started our saws immediately. We just stood there for a second longer, listening to the wind die down, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy with teeth. We were standing over that mutilated elk, realizing that the fire wasn't the only thing hunting us in the valley. I'm going to tell you exactly what stepped out of the smoke in just a second, but first, if you want to survive more high-stakes stories like this every week, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. You don't want to be left alone in the dark. All right, let's get back to the fire line. Dig, I want to see mineral soil. Scrape it down to the bone. My voice was raw, shouting over the relentless whine of the Husqvarnas and the crackle of burning timber. We were moving like a machine now, a desperate assembly line of muscle and steel. The adrenaline from the kill site hadn't faded. It had curdled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Every time a branch snapped in the unburned fuel behind us, heads snapped up, eyes widened. We weren't just fighting a fire anymore. We were digging a moat. "Vogel, watch that slop over on the left," I yelled. Vogel was already there, swinging his Pulaski with grim efficiency, burying the blade into the smoldering duff and flinging it back into the black. We were making good time. The line was wide, clean, and anchored to a rock scree that should have held. By the book, we were winning. But the book didn't account for this. The wind was howling out of the north, a steady, driving gale that pushed the smoke flat against the ground. By all the laws of physics I'd spent 2 decades studying, the fire should have been running southeast, pushing away from us, driving toward the river. It wasn't. I stopped swinging my tool, wiping a smear of soot and sweat from my forehead. I watched the column. The main head of the fire wasn't following the wind. It was hooking. It started as a subtle shift, a finger of flame creeping along the understory against the breeze. But then it surged. A wall of orange heat flared up on our right flank, tearing through a patch of dried sagebrush with a roar that sounded like a jet engine spinning up. "Boss," Vogel shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Look at the wind. It's blowing north, but the head is hooking south." I stared at it, my brain refusing to accept the data. Fire breathes, it seeks fuel, but it doesn't make tactical decisions. It doesn't flank. Yet that was exactly what was happening. The fire had ignored the wind and the slope. It had hooked hard to the south, racing across the ridge line we had designated as our secondary escape route. In a matter of minutes, the flames had erected a wall of heat between us and the high ground. It felt deliberate. It felt like a sheepdog cutting off a wandering ewe. It felt like we were being steered. "Drop back," I ordered, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "The escape route is compromised. We need to tighten the circle, pull back to the rock slide." The crew hesitated for a fraction of a second, the confusion of veteran firefighters seeing fire do something impossible, before training took over. They grabbed their gear, retreating from the line we had just bled to build. We were scrambling over the loose shale of the rock slide, the heat pressing against our backs like a physical weight, when the rhythm of the retreat broke. The buzz of a chainsaw died abruptly. Hold up. It was Tully. The rookie was standing near the edge of the tree line, about 20 yards below us. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was staring into the unburned timber, into the dense, choking haze of smoke that was drifting against the current. "Tully, move your ass," I screamed. "We don't stop here." Tully didn't move. He raised his chainsaw, pointing the guide bar like a weapon into the gloom of the forest. "Boss," his voice cracked, high and terrified. "I got a straggler. I got eyes on a civilian." I froze. A civilian. Out here, the bob was closed. No hikers, no campers. "Where?" I slid down the shale, my boots skidding on the loose rock, bringing me up beside him. "There," Tully breathed, his chest heaving. "In the smoke. I saw him standing by that snag. He was just watching us." I squinted into the gray curtain. Visibility was less than 50 feet. The smoke was swirling, thick and oily, creating phantom shapes that dissolved as soon as you focused on them. "I don't see anything, Tully," I said, grabbing his shoulder to shake him out of it. "It's a shadow. It's a tree stump." "No," Tully insisted, ripping his gaze away from the trees to look at me wild-eyed. "It was a guy, a big guy. He was wearing a fur coat or something. He was standing on 2 legs, boss. I swear to God. He looked right at me." A fur coat, in 90-degree heat, standing in a wildfire. The image of the elk, ripped in half, shattered outward, flashed in my mind. The blood that hadn't burned, the silence of the woods. "Boss," Vogel hissed from behind me. He had come down the slope, his weapon of choice, a heavy felling axe gripped tight in both hands. "We need to move, now." "I'm telling you it's a camper," Tully yelled at the tree line. "Hey, you, get out of there, the fire is flanking." "Tully, shut up," I barked. But it was too late. Tully had shouted into the void, and from the darkness of the smoke something answered. It wasn't a voice. It was the snap of a heavy branch breaking, the sound of something massive stepping forward. I squinted, my eyes streaming from the acrid bite of pine resin and ozone, trying to force the gray shifting shapes into focus. At first, there was nothing but the swirling curtain of the inversion layer, a wall of heat and ash that distorted everything behind it like a mirage on hot asphalt. Then the wind lulled, the curtain parted just enough. Tully was right. 30 yards out, standing in a gap between 2 burning lodgepole pines, was a figure. It was tall, too tall and broad, standing perfectly upright on 2 legs. The smoke clung to it, making it look like a silhouette cut from black construction paper. It was motionless, watching us with a stillness that felt heavy, almost gravitational. My training kicked in before my brain could process the impossibility of the situation. In a fire, seconds are lives. If that was a civilian, they were already dead if they didn't move now. The fire was hooking. The oxygen was being sucked out of the valley floor. They had to be disoriented, hypoxic, frozen in panic. I stepped past Tully, cupping my hands around my mouth to amplify my voice over the roar of the consuming fuel. "Forest Service," I screamed, my voice raw and authoritative. "You are in an active burn zone. Move your ass. Turn around and head for the river, now." The figure didn't flinch. It didn't turn its head. It didn't wave for help. It just stood there, towering over the burning underbrush, staring directly at us. A cold dread, sharper and deeper than the heat of the fire, pierced my chest. Humans panic. Humans run. Even shock has a vibration to it, a trembling, a looking around for an exit. This thing was absolute statuary. It was observing us with the cold, detached patience of a butcher, waiting for the cattle to settle. "Boss," Tully whispered, stepping back, his chainsaw dipping low. "That's not a guy, look at the arms." Before I could ask what he meant, the atmosphere shifted. The fire, creating its own weather system, sucked a massive breath of oxygen in from the canyon floor. A sudden, violent updraft ripped the veil of smoke away, clearing the air between us and the tree line for a single, crystal-clear heartbeat. The shout died in my throat. It wasn't a camper. It wasn't a poacher in a ghillie suit. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall. What Tully had mistaken for a heavy winter coat was a dense mat of dark, coarse fur, matted with mud and dried blood. The fur on its left flank was singed, smoking faintly where the embers had touched it, but the creature didn't seem to care. Its shoulders were immense, bunched with muscle like an NFL linebacker on steroids, tapering down to a waist that looked disturbingly human. But the arms were too long, ending in hands that hung past its knees, hands that were currently curled into fists the size of grapefruits. Then I saw the head. It was a nightmare grafted onto a humanoid body. A long canine snout, scarred and black, with lips pulled back to reveal teeth that shone wetly in the firelight. Its ears were pinned back against its skull, and its eyes. They were amber, glowing with a bioluminescent intensity that cut through the twilight gloom. They weren't animal eyes wide with fear. They were intelligent. They were hateful. Jesus Christ, Vogel breathed behind me. The creature's ears twitched. It heard us. It didn't roar. It didn't posture. It simply decided that the observation period was over. The transition was sickeningly fluid. One moment it was standing like a man. The next, it dropped forward onto all fours, its spine snapping into a predatory arch. The motion was so fast it blurred. "Run!" I screamed, shoving Tully up the scree slope. "Get back to the line, move!" The creature launched itself. It didn't run like a wolf, and it didn't run like a bear. It moved with a terrifying spider-like agility, tearing through the burning brush. It hit a wall of briars that was fully engulfed in flames, a spot that would have melted the synthetic soles of our boots, and didn't even slow down. I saw the fire lick at its fur, saw the sparks fly as it crashed through the burning debris, immune to the pain, immune to the heat. It was closing the 30-yard gap in seconds, churning the earth, its heavy panting audible even over the roar of the wildfire. We weren't fighting the fire anymore. We were being hunted by the thing that started it. The distance closed in a heartbeat. 1 second the creature was a blur of matted fur and muscle tearing through the burning brush, and the next, it was on top of us. "Tully, move!" I screamed, lunging forward, but I was too slow. The creature didn't bite. It didn't slash. It simply lowered its shoulder like a battering ram and plowed into the rookie. The impact sounded like a car hitting a deer, a wet, heavy thud that knocked the air out of the entire clearing. Tully was lifted off his feet, thrown backward 5 yards into a pile of gray ash and smoldering duff. He hit the ground with a grunt, his chainsaw clattering away into the rocks. The beast skidded to a halt, its claws gouging deep furrows in the earth as it turned, looming over the stunned kid. Up close, the smell was atrocious, a mix of wet dog, sulfur, and something coppery like old blood. "Hit the throttles," Vogel roared, stepping between Tully and the monster. It was instinct. We didn't have guns, we didn't have bear spray, we had Husqvarnas. Vogel yanked the starter cord on his saw and the engine screamed to life. I did the same, ripping the cord until the machine roared. We didn't cut, we just squeezed the triggers, revving the engines to maximum RPM. The high-pitched mechanical wail pierced the roar of the fire, echoing off the canyon walls. The creature flinched. It pinned its ears back, snapping its jaws at the air, clearly agitated by the frequency. It swiped a massive, clawed hand at Vogel, a testing jab that missed his face by inches. But the wall of noise was too much for its senses. It let out a frustrated, chattering shriek that vibrated in my teeth, then spun around and vanished back into the smoke as quickly as it had appeared. "Check him," I yelled, keeping my saw revved, sweeping the barrel of the guide bar back and forth across the hazy tree line. "Vogel, check the kid." Vogel dropped to a knee beside Tully. The rookie was gasping for air, clutching his chest. The Kevlar chest rig of his line gear had taken the brunt of the hit, but the force had clearly cracked ribs. "He's breathing," Vogel shouted, "but we need to get out of here now." "Get him up," I commanded. I unclipped the Bendix King radio from my harness. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely find the transmit button. We needed a heli bucket. We needed a hotshot crew. We needed the cavalry. Missoula Dispatch, this is Jumper Leader 7, I yelled into the mic, pressing the speaker against my ear to hear over the fire. Emergency traffic. We have an aggressive wildlife encounter. Crew member injured. We need immediate extraction. Do you copy? I waited for the crackle of the dispatcher's voice. I waited for the calm, reassuring tone of the operator back at the aerial fire depot. I got nothing. It wasn't silence. It wasn't the empty hiss of a dead zone. It was a sound I had never heard on a radio frequency before. CHHHKRR. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking sound. It sounded like static, but it had a cadence. It sounded like heavy breathing close to a microphone. It sounded like teeth gnashing together. Dispatch, say again, I screamed, adjusting the squelch. I am not copying, we have a code red. CHHHKRR, growl. The sound cut through the static, a low, distorted guttural vibration that made the speaker mesh rattle. It wasn't interference from the lightning. It was a broadcast. I stared at the radio, the blood draining from my face. I switched channels, Tactical 1, air to ground, NIFC command. Every channel was the same. The clicking, the breathing, the growling. Boss, Vogel was dragging Tully to his feet, staring at me. Did you get the plane? I lowered the radio slowly, the realization hitting me harder than the heat of the fire. The radio is dead, I whispered. Something is jamming it. I looked around at the box canyon we had backed ourselves into. I looked at the fire, which had defied the wind to flank us on the south. I looked at the kill site where the elk had been ripped apart, not eaten. And I looked at the smoke, swirling in that unnatural, tightening circle. The pieces slammed together in my mind. The elk wasn't a random kill. It was a warning. The fire hooking south wasn't a freak weather event. It was a gate closing. They aren't just animals, I said, my voice trembling. Vogel, look at the fire. Look at how it moved. Vogel looked at the wall of flames cutting off our retreat, then back at the dark tree line where the creature had disappeared. They're hurting us, Vogel said, the color draining from his ash-streaked face. We aren't fighting a wildfire, I said, gripping the handle of my chainsaw until my knuckles turned white. We dropped into a hunting ground. They started the fire to flush the game out of the valley. I looked at Tully, clutching his broken ribs. I looked at the terrified faces of the rest of the crew. And we just volunteered to be the prey. I clipped the radio back to my harness, the static growl still chattering in my ear like a persistent insect. It was useless. We were cut off, miles from the nearest road, with a rookie hacking up blood in the dirt and a wildfire that was being driven by something other than the wind. Boss, Vogel hissed, his voice tight. 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. I didn't need to look to know what he was seeing. The smoke around us was thickening, but the shapes were unmistakable. They were circling. I counted 3 distinct silhouettes moving through the gray haze of the lodgepole pines. They weren't charging like the first one. They were packing us, moving with a fluid, loping gait that made them hard to track. They dipped in and out of the smoke, using the shifting visibility as camouflage. They knew we were cornered. They knew the main fire was pushing us against the canyon wall. They were just waiting for the heat to wear us down, or for the panic to make us run. I looked down at the tools in my hands, a Pulaski axe and a chainsaw. Against a tree, they were weapons. Against 700 pounds of muscle and hate that could snap an elk in half, they were toys. I had a flare gun in my pack with 3 rounds, maybe enough to annoy one of them. Definitely not enough to stop a pack. We didn't have firepower, but we had fuel. Vogel, I said, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. Grab the drip torches. Vogel looked at me, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before the logic clicked. He was a veteran. He understood fire behavior better than he understood people. If you can't stop the fire, you remove the fuel. And if you can't stop the predator, you change the environment. Fight fire with fire, Vogel asked, already unstrapping the red canister from his pack. We burn it out, I said, pointing to the strip of unburned sagebrush and dry grass standing between us and the tree line where the shapes were prowling. We create a buffer, a wall. If they want to get to us, they have to walk through hell to do it. Diaz O'Neill, I shouted, get the fuel, we're lighting a backburn now. The crew moved with the desperate speed of the damned. We popped the lock rings on the drip torches, flipping the wicks out. The smell of the fuel mixture, 3 parts diesel, 1 part gasoline, cut through the scent of wood smoke. It was a heavy, volatile stench that usually meant hard work. Today, it smelled like survival. Line it out, I ordered. 10 yards in front of the crew, pour it heavy. Vogel took the point. He tilted the red canister and the fuel splashed onto the wick. He struck his lighter and the tip of the torch roared to life, dripping liquid fire onto the parched earth. He began to run, trailing a line of flame across the dry grass. The creatures saw the movement. To my left, a massive shape stepped out of the smoke, abandoning its stealth. It was larger than the first one, its fur matted with gray ash, its lips curled back to reveal yellowed fangs. It let out a huff, a sharp exhalation of air that sounded like a steam valve blowing, and crouched, ready to spring. Light it all, I screamed, grabbing a second torch and sprinting in the opposite direction. I tilted the canister, letting the flaming diesel slash across the sagebrush. The fuel hit the dry vegetation, and the reaction was instantaneous. Whoosh! The backburn didn't just catch, it exploded. The updraft from the main fire sucked the new flames upward, feeding them oxygen. In seconds, a wall of orange fire, 10 feet high and growing, roared to life between us and the stalking pack. The heat was intense, singing my eyebrows even from 20 feet back, but I didn't turn away. I watched the fire wall rise. The creature that had been preparing to charge skidded to a halt. The sudden eruption of light and heat seemed to overload its senses. For a nocturnal predator relying on thermal vision or night sight, the flare-up must have been blinding. It reared back, shielding its eyes with a massive clawed hand. Then it screamed. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched, oscillating shriek that sounded disturbingly human, like a man screaming in agony, layered over the guttural growl of a wolf. It was a sound of frustration and rage. From the smoke behind it, 2 other voices joined in, a chorus of nightmares howling at the fire that had cheated them of their meal. "It's holding," Vogel yelled, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "They're backing off." I watched the shadows retreat into the deeper gloom of the forest, unable to cross the thermal barrier we had just erected. We had bought ourselves time, maybe minutes, maybe less. "Don't celebrate yet," I said, dropping the empty torch and grabbing my saw. I looked toward the canyon mouth, the only path left open to us. We just cut off their approach, but we also just cut off our only way back up the mountain. The only way out is down. The wall of flame we'd ignited was roaring, consuming the sagebrush with a violence that made the air shimmer. It was a barrier, strictly visual and thermal, but it was temporary. Behind it, the main fire, the one pushing from the north, was a tidal wave of heat that would eventually swallow our defensive line and us along with it. We had bought ourselves a head start, but the clock was ticking louder than the blood pounding in my ears. "Go move to the river," I screamed, grabbing Tully by his harness straps to keep him upright. The rookie was pale, clutching his ribs, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The hit he'd taken would have cracked a sternum without the Kevlar. With it, he was likely looking at fractures and a bruised lung. But pain was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. "I'm good, boss, I'm good," Tully wheezed, stumbling forward, his boots sliding on the loose rock. We threw ourselves down the canyon descent. It wasn't a trail, it was a wash, a steep, jagged scar in the earth filled with scree and fallen timber. Every step was a gamble. Shale shifted under our feet, sending mini avalanches of stone clattering down into the gloom below. The heat was absolute. It wasn't just hot, it was heavy. The air temperature in the canyon had to be pushing 140 degrees. Breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. The smoke was trapped between the canyon walls, thick and acrid, stinging our eyes and coating our throats with a layer of grit that tasted like copper and charcoal. "Watch your footing," Vogel yelled from the front, using his Pulaski like a walking stick to stabilize his slide. "Don't ride the slide, digging your heels in." We were sprinting, sliding, and scrambling, a chaotic tumbling descent toward the Flathead River, which was still miles away. The roar of the fire behind us was a constant, low-frequency rumble, a reminder of what was snapping at our heels. But it wasn't the fire I was watching. As the canyon floor leveled out slightly, transitioning from the steep scree slope to a narrow, winding dry creek bed, I looked up. The canyon walls rose 300 feet on either side of us, steep, rocky cliffs dotted with stubborn pines that were already smoking from the radiant heat. And there, outlined against the bruised purple and orange of the sky, I saw them. "Movement, right ridge," Diaz shouted, pointing his chainsaw toward the skyline. I tracked his line of sight. At first, it looked like shadows cast by the flickering light of the fire, but shadows don't run against the wind. They were up there. The shapes were black, loping silhouettes moving along the rim of the canyon with terrifying speed. They weren't scrambling or struggling with the terrain like we were. They were flowing over the rocks, jumping gaps in the stone with an agility that defied their bulk. I looked to the left ridge, two more. They were parallel tracking us. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't chasing us from behind anymore. They had split the pack. They knew the terrain better than we did. They knew that this wide wash eventually narrowed into a choke point, a slot canyon before the river, where the walls closed in and the escape route became a single-file death trap. "They aren't retreating," I yelled to Vogel, my voice cracking from the smoke. "They're flanking us. They're heading for the narrows." Vogel looked up, tracking the creatures as they raced us toward the bottom. He saw the geometry of the ambush forming in real time. "They're gonna drop on us when the walls get tight," Vogel shouted back, his face a mask of soot and sweat. "Faster," I roared, shoving Tully forward, ignoring the pained grunt that escaped his lips. "We have to beat them to the gap. If they get there first, we're dead. Run." We abandoned caution. We stopped picking our lines and just let gravity take us. We sprinted down the dry creek bed, boots smashing against river stones, ankles twisting, lungs burning. Above us, the dark shapes kept pace, effortless and silent, predators watching their prey run blindly into the bottle. The race wasn't against the fire anymore. It was a race to see who would own the high ground when the trap snapped shut. The canyon walls squeezed inward, forcing us into a single-file sprint through a chute of jagged limestone no wider than a pickup truck. The air here was stagnant, superheated by the fire raging on the ridges above, pressing down on us like a physical weight. We were running toward the sound of rushing water, the Flathead River promising salvation, but the geometry of the trap was absolute. We rounded the final bend, the river coming into view as a sliver of silver 200 feet below. Then the sky fell. A massive shadow detached itself from the canyon rim and plummeted down into the gap. It hit the ground with a seismic impact that shook the loose shale under my boots, kicking up a cloud of dust and ash. We skidded to a halt, boots scraping frantically for traction, piling into each other to avoid running straight into the nightmare blocking our path. It was the Alpha. I knew it instantly. It dwarfed the others we had seen. Standing fully upright on its hind legs, it filled the narrow passage, a wall of muscle and hate. Its chest was a ruin of old, silvery keloid scars and fresh, weeping burns where the fire had licked it. It didn't roar. It just stood there, panting, its breath rattling in a chest the size of a refined fuel barrel, Its amber eyes locked onto us, burning with a terrifying recognition. It knew we were the ones who had lit the fire. "Back!" I screamed, shoving Tully behind me. There was nowhere to go. The fire was closing in from the rear, and the Alpha owned the only exit. I raised the flare gun, my hand shaking violently. I didn't bother aiming for the head. The target was too erratic. I aimed for center mass. Pop! The magnesium round hissed through the air, trailing a spiral of white smoke. It struck the creature high in the shoulder, burying itself in the matted fur. The chemical fire ignited instantly, burning at 2,000 degrees. The Alpha roared, a sound that vibrated in my sternum and swiped at the flare, tearing a chunk of its own burning flesh away in a spray of dark blood. But it didn't retreat. Pain wasn't a deterrent anymore, it was fuel. It dropped to all fours, muscles coiling to spring. "Vogel, no!" I shouted. But Vogel was already moving. He didn't run away. He didn't freeze. He revved his Husqvarna 372 XP to its maximum RPM, the engine screaming a high-pitched war cry, and charged. "Get to the water!" Vogel bellowed, swinging the chainsaw like a medieval broadsword. The collision was brutal. The Alpha lunged, jaws snapping, but Vogel met it with the spinning chain. The guide bar connected with the creature's forearm as it swiped, the steel teeth biting into bone. Blood and fur sprayed into the air, painting Vogel's yellow Nomex shirt crimson. The creature shrieked, recoiling for a split second, but the force of its blow knocked the saw sideways, nearly ripping it from Vogel's grip. The Alpha recovered faster than a human ever could, rearing back to deliver a killing blow. Vogel was exposed. He stumbled back, the saw stalling out, leaving him defenseless against the descending claws. Then a blur of silver flew over my shoulder. "Eat this!" Tully screamed. The rookie had ripped his emergency fire shelter from its hard plastic case. It wasn't designed to be a weapon. It was a foil cocoon meant to keep a firefighter from baking to death in a burnover. But Tully didn't deploy it to hide. He shook it out, the aluminum layers crinkling loudly, and threw it like a cast net over the creature's head. The effect was instantaneous chaos. The Alpha thrashed, its claws shredding the foil, but the material clung to it, reflecting the firelight, blinding it and confusing its senses with the sudden rustling noise. It swiped blindly at the air, fighting the inanimate object wrapped around its face. "Now go!" I grabbed Vogel by the harness and hauled him toward the edge. We didn't look back. We didn't hesitate. We sprinted past the thrashing, silver-wrapped nightmare and threw ourselves off the limestone ledge. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but gravity and smoke. Then, the freezing cold of the Flathead River hit me like a sledgehammer, driving the air from my lungs and turning the world into a chaotic swirl of bubbles and darkness. We were alive, but we were in the water, and the hunt wasn't over. The Flathead River didn't care that we were burning. It only cared that we were in its way. The current took us, tumbling us over slick river stones and dragging us through deep, freezing pools that shocked the heat from our bodies instantly. I don't remember swimming. I remember flailing, gasping for air in the chaotic foam, and gripping Vogel's harness with a death grip until my fingers went numb. We washed up miles downstream on a wide gravel bar, coughing up water and silt. I crawled onto the dry stones, my body feeling like a single, massive bruise. Beside me, Vogel dragged Tully out of the shallows. The rookie was limp, his skin blue-gray, but he was breathing, ragged, wet gasps that rattled in his chest. I rolled onto my back and looked upriver. The canyon we had just escaped was gone. In its place was a towering wall of black smoke and orange flame that reached into the stratosphere. The fire had jumped the river. The Bob Marshall Wilderness was burning with a violence I had never seen in 20 years of service. It wasn't just consuming fuel, it was erasing evidence. I watched the inferno rage for a long time, shivering uncontrollably as the adrenaline crashed, listening to the distant roar that sounded too much like the growl of the thing that had hunted us. Then, the darkness took me. I didn't wake up in a sleeping bag. I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor and the smell of antiseptic that was too clean, too sharp. I opened my eyes. I was in a hospital room in Missoula. My arms were bandaged and my throat felt like I had swallowed a handful of razor blades, but I wasn't alone. Two men were sitting in chairs at the foot of my bed. They weren't doctors. They were wearing charcoal suits that looked out of place in a trauma ward, and they didn't look tired. "Mr. Garrick," the one on the left said. He didn't offer a name. "Glad to see you're awake. We need to go over the incident report." I tried to sit up, but the room spun. "Where's my crew? Where, Vogel Tully?" "Mr. Vogel is in surgery for lacerations to his arm," the man said, his voice flat. "Mr. Tully is in the ICU. Severe smoke inhalation and a crushed sternum, but they'll survive." I slumped back against the pillow. The fire, the thing in the fire. The second man leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The fire, Mr. Garrick, was a tragedy. A textbook burnover event caused by sudden, erratic wind shifts in the canyon. You and your team were trapped. It happens." "Trapped?" I rasped, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "We were herded. There were animals out there, bipeds, 7 feet tall. They started the fire." The men didn't blink. They didn't look at each other with concern. They just looked at me with the patience of a parent dealing with a confused child. "Hypoxia is a dangerous thing," the first man said softly. "Combined with extreme heat stress and carbon monoxide poisoning, it causes powerful hallucinations. The brain tries to make sense of the trauma, Mr. Garrick. It invents monsters to explain the chaos." "I saw it," I hissed. "Tully saw it. Vogel hit one with a chainsaw. Check the saw, check the DNA on the chain." "The equipment was lost in the river," the man said, cutting me off smoothly. "And your helmet cameras. Unfortunately, the heat damaged the SD cards beyond recovery. There is no footage." Of course there wasn't. They had scrubbed it. They had stripped us of the proof before we were even dry. "Tully is talking about werewolves," the second man added, shaking his head dismissively. "We've recommended a psychiatric hold. For his own good. He needs to process the trauma of the burnover without delusions." I looked at them, clean, calm, and lying through their teeth. I realized then that the fire in the canyon wasn't the only trap. This room was a trap. The narrative was already written. If I pushed it, if I talked about glowing eyes and bulletproof fur, I wouldn't be the hero who saved his crew. I'd be the crazy old smoke jumper who cracked under pressure. I'd be locked away in a ward just like Tully. "The official report," the man said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, "will state that your team performed heroically during a catastrophic weather event. You saved your men. Take the win, Mr. Garrick. Sign the papers." They left a folder on the bedside table and walked out. I stared at the white ceiling tile, listening to the sterile hum of the ventilation system. Outside the window, I could see the distant haze of smoke hanging over the mountains. The news would call it a natural disaster. They would talk about dry lightning and wind shear. They blamed the scars on falling timber. They blamed the trauma on the fire. But I know what I saw. We didn't fight a wildfire that day. We interrupted a hunt.